Ağızlarınıza sağlık.
Teşekkür.
Söyleşi de biraz bu sebeple bazı takılmalar yaşamıştık ama umuyoruz ki diğer söyleşilerimizde böyle bir problem olmayacak, yaşanmayacak. Video akışının daha düzgün olmasını temenni ediyoruz. E, Sıradaki söyleşi az önce bahsettiğim gibi Kurt Gray hakkında. Gerekirse Gray'ler. Şu anda North Carolina Üniversitesi'nde psikoloji. Aynı zamanda aynı üniversitede Deep Beliefs Lab'de ve The Science of Moral Understanding Center'da direktör. Doktorasını Harvard Üniversitesi'nde tamamlayan Gray, en derin inançlarımızla ahlaki bölünmeler arasında nasıl köprüler arası çalışmalara sahip, ahlak ve din de dahil olmak üzere insanların en önemli inançları ve bunların toplumu nasıl etkilediğini araştırıyor çok temelde. Özellikle etik, sosyal psikoloji ve yapay zeka uzmanı geliştirme çalışmaları sayesinde hem kamuda hem de özel sektörde kuruluşların dönüşümüne de yardımcı oluyor. Şimdi Sercan senden yardım alabiliriz. Videoyu izlemek amacıyla. İyi seyirler herkese.
Question is a field of bizarre and interesting things. I mean, the modern field was kicked off by a question about having sex with your sibling and then, sex with a frozen chicken. So I feel like we're already kind of something interesting. The critique that's maybe the most interesting is Jonathan Haidt, who has critiqued my work a fair, I think because I've critiqued his work, argues that my theory is Procrustean. I'm not even sure how to say it, but it's a Procrustean bed is someone who couldn't fit in a bed, and so he cut off his legs so it would fit in the bed, which is an argument that I'm cutting off some of the diversity in moral psychology to kind of fit into my theory. I don't think that's true. We can talk about that, but I thought that was a vivid example. And I think as part of the same critique, John has said that I'm wielding Occam's chainsaw, Occam's razor, which I also thought was a very almost beautiful poetic description of of what I'm doing. I think it's also not true that I'm wielding a chainsaw, but I don't mind the image. I have a chainsaw, and so why not wield it in moral psychology a little bit? It's a great question. It's always hard to predict the future. I mean, we certainly know where the past was, which was starting in 2001, right? I mean, there's lots of moral psychologists, but I feel like John Haidt's paper in 2001 with sex with your sister or your brother, and then Josh Green was looking at trolleys. And so we've got these two situations, trolleys and then weird things. And I think those situations were really interesting because they were atypical, right? They're not the kind of things that moral situations. They're not the kind of things that people think about. pushing a fat man up a bridge, right? And so I think those were useful because they help illuminate the structure of the moral mind, how it's tied to emotion, and how moral diversity is important. I think right now it's moving towards more kind of everyday or generally representative scenarios. So one reason that I think it's important is because like 95% of our moral world is obviously about harm. If you think of like what laws forbid, they forbid things that are harmful. Assault and theft and fraud, murder, right? I think a lot of our moral world is grounded in harm. But I think even beyond that, if you think of like morality in our kind of like everyday relationships, there's been a lot of the field that hasn't really focused on that. And I think that's where people's around, right? Did I say something cruel to a friend? Did I not help out my parents when they needed help? Right? These kind of more relational things. And so I think the field is going that way. And I think there's some folks who are already doing some really important work on that, but really taking it out of these kind of abstract questions of, I don't know, loyalty and purity and thinking of kind of everyday personal relationships. I mean, so I have this paper called 6 Guidelines for Interesting Research, and it's a very short paper, so if anyone wants to read it, it shouldn't be too much of a heavy lift. And in that paper, one of the things I recommend is to kind of ignore other papers a little bit and focus on kind of interesting phenomena. So if there's something in your life that's really interesting, kind of start there and then kind of back into the literature, rather than like if you start out with like this JPSP says this and this psych science says this, and like how do I make sense of these 2 different theories together? Like that's a interesting question, and I've done work like that, but it's so much more interesting to think about this really weird thing happened, right? Like I had someone in my lab, and she was vegan, but she gave her cat meat, right? And I'm like, oh, that's kind of a weird thing, right? Like it's weird paradox. Like you're giving your cat meat, but you think it's immoral. And of course, she thought it's like the cat's nature to eat meat and it's a predator. But some people think humans are predator, right? So there's like a big question of like what is human nature and like what is morality when it comes to what we eat. And I think those questions are a great place to start, right? And so I would recommend kind of starting with phenomena. When you test things, my recommendation is to make sure that there's a broader spectrum of moral scenarios. So let me unpack that. So there's lots of work in the field where you just like take one scenario, right? Like one trolley problem, looking at like eating worms or marrying your cat. I don't know, like weird things like that, right? But if you ask about a whole spectrum of things like taking the bus or hitting a kid or lying to your parents or stealing from the grocery store, if you look at a whole bunch of things and the things that are really interesting to you, then you get a much richer picture of what morality actually is, especially to everyday people. And then that will inform your theories and prevent us from making kind of absurd conclusions that don't match.
Evet, teşekkür ediyoruz. 16.45'te oturum başkanlığını Beyza Tepe hocamızın üstlendiği 5. oturumumuzla devam ediyor olacağız.